Wow, we just sang that song, surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. You know what that means? If you really think about that for a moment. It said if 2 or 3, it doesn't take a lot. We've got more than that, so we're covered. We are literally in the presence of God. Amen. Isn't that exciting? I'm hoping you're excited, and I hope it puts a smile on your face, and I'm kind of hoping that when we bust out of here in a little bit, that the first person you see, you let them know. You said, listen, I've been in the presence of the Lord this morning, and it was great. Just let them know that. And by the way, it's good to have you all here this morning. You folks we haven't seen for a bit, thank you for being with us. It's just a joy to worship God together, isn't it?
Praise the Lord.
And I personally am grateful for each and every one of you. Good deal. Well, anyway, we're back. We're back. Right back in the book that I'm beginning to believe is the most exciting and dramatic book in the entire Old Testament. And it fits beautifully with our study in the Gospel of Mark that RT is teaching during our Sunday school hour.
Amen.
Mark goes from one place to the next, and kind of in the blink of an eye. You're here 1 minute, the next minute you're in a boat, you're on the shore, you're all over the place. And it's going bang, 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 just like that. As Mark describes the ministry of Jesus Christ with real passion as he reveals the deep truths of God to us. The book of Esther describes the detailed workings of God on behalf of his people, while at the same time, just like Mark does for the New Testament, it reveals deep eternal truths about our God like no other Old Testament book does, at least in my opinion, especially if you take into account God isn't mentioned in any of the 10 chapters of Esther, and yet he's in every chapter. It's awesome. And for me personally, the further we're getting into Esther, the more time that we're spending studying it, and the more it's becoming my favorite book in the Old Testament. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I know it's Bonnie's. It's always said Ruth and Esther. I don't know if there's a woman thing going on there or something, but those are her 2 favorite Old Testament books. And but having spent the time that we have spent, and I'm spending personally in studying all in Esther, I mean, to coin a phrase from McDonald's, and I don't know if I can do this without infringing on copyright, but I'm loving it. I am loving it. It is just it's so good. My hope is, and as I pray for each of you, my prayer is that you're loving it too. I hope you're getting it, because it's a very, very special book, and it's a blessing that, and I don't know where it came from to even, take some time and go through this book. As I was putting together my preaching schedule, I usually do it out, 6-8 months in advance and kind of put it in line at least, and I don't know where it came from. But here we are, and I'm enjoying every minute. I hope you are. Anyway, let's take a minute to pray, and then we'll get into the book itself here in just a minute or two. Father, we again thank you. We are just so thrilled, and our hearts are full of joy, even though we're dealing with some hard stuff. Each of us in different ways, and life is not easy, God. But yet we know our hearts are full of joy, because you're here with us. And Father, we thank you for your presence. We thank you for your involvement in our lives. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your Spirit, for your Son. We thank you for the book of Esther. And who would have thought that it is just so deeply laden with so much of who you are and how you interact and how you involve yourself in the intricate parts of our personal lives. Thank you for that encouragement, that we can have confidence that no matter what we're dealing with, no matter what we're going through, no matter how things look, you're leading us And Father, we're so grateful for that. And I pray that you bless our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, so much has happened in just 5 chapters. I mean, we've introduced all kinds of characters to our story. We have poor, and I use poor, and I think from more of a, you know, a sense that I feel bad for Vashti. You know, I think she was trying to be honorable. I don't think she was trying to be obstinate when she refused to come before King Xerxes and his boys. We have, and we've met somewhat. I kind of look at him as if you read between the lines and you kind of see how he's interacted with his, you know, with his advisors and this, that, and the other thing. I kind of have to categorize him as somewhat out of touch, King Xerxes. We've been introduced to the 7 eunuchs who served him. Also, his 7 nobles who Esther tells us, or the book of Esther tells us, were experts in matters of law and justice. Then we have the sometimes obstinate, but ever faithful cousin Mordecai. We have assassination planning Bigthana and Teresh. We have the overly proud and the deeply hateful, you know who, Haman. We have helpful Hathach. He's the eunuch that was assigned to care for Xerxes' new queen, Esther. And he was the go-between. Remember, between Mordecai and Esther, is that the dialogue was going between them as to how Esther was going to hopefully step up and take care of things. Then we have Haman's conniving wife, Zeresh, and his friends. And of course we have the star of our story, the exceptional Queen Esther. So that's a lot of different people, a lot of different mix there. And then we saw in chapters 1 and 2, we saw Vashti removed as queen by King Xerxes. We saw her being replaced by Esther. And then we saw Mordecai saving King Xerxes from a planned assassination plot. In chapter 3, Haman comes out of nowhere, right? And he becomes the number 2 man in Xerxes' kingdom. And we've seen how that move, him being placed in that number 2 spot in royalty, exposed Haman's uncontrollable pride and his extreme hatred for Mordecai and the Jewish people. Then in chapter 4, we experience Mordecai's misery because of Haman's hateful plan to exterminate the Jews. And then we learned of Mordecai, or his mandate to his queen, or to his cousin, Queen Esther, where he messaged her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. And that was even though it could possibly mean her death. Remember? Last week, chapter 5, we walked right into Xerxes' throne room, right along Queen Esther, remember? She was out in the waiting room. King Caesar kind of summons her to come in, and we walked right alongside Queen Esther, shaking like she was, hoping that Xerxes would extend that gold scepter, remember? And allow her entry so she could make her entreaty, or her request, if you will, to him. And remember, one author described that moment, that very moment, the moment that Queen Esther is before King Xerxes, and he's sitting on his throne, and he extends that gold scepter. Remember that one author, he says that's the pinnacle of plot tension in the entire book. In other words, that's the turning point in the entire book, because up to that point, everything is building up, to set the stage for the rest of the story. And from my perspective, it's a doozy. It's a doozy. At first, Esther's entreaty was that both Xerxes and Haman would attend a series of 2 banquets over the next 2 days that she would host in their honor. Xerxes agrees. Haman heads home. He's flying high. All right, Not only is the king made me number 2, but the queen, she's inviting just the king and I to these banquets. Well, that's until he crosses paths with Mordecai, remember, at the king's gate. And again, he's overwhelmed with his pride and his hatred. So he goes home, and with his loving wife and his caring friends, they devise a plan to eliminate Mordecai the very next day, which is long before the scheduled date for the destruction of Mordecai and the Jewish people. Remember, that had been set in the future. Haman couldn't wait. And that brings us to chapter 6. And now I know you're probably thinking, well, gee, Pastor John, you know, you kind of keep telling us this stuff over and over every week. I want you to know that we've been reviewing where we've been each week. But I believe for us to get everything that God is showing us here, it's crucial, because I want us to remember, I want us to know how we got to where we are each week. So we can kind of see step by step. We can see God working in so many different people's lives in so many different ways. Some dramatic, some subtle, some not even almost noticeable, but yet He still does. Because there's way too many nooks and crannies. They're kind of like those, what are those English muffins? Thomas's English muffins? Remember, it says right on the pack, all the nooks and crannies. This book has so many nooks and crannies, and each one of them builds on the other to weave an incredible story demonstrating God's complete sovereignty and His providence over His people and His creation. Let's look at Mordecai's majesty in Esther chapter 6. Turn there if you haven't already, and I'm going to read that, verses 1 through 14. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway. Remember, these were the guys that were right there with the king. They had access to him, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this, the king asked. Nothing's been done for him, his attendants answered. And the king said in verse 4, who's in the court? Now what had happened, Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him, remember the day before. His attendant answers, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So when Haman entered, the king asked him, he says, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? What can we do for him? So Haman, he thought to himself, and he said, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king that delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. You've probably seen the horses, you know, with the little tassel, whatever they stick up there, a little brush thing, whatever. That's what he wants, or is thinking. And he says, then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested. So far, so good. For Mordecai. For Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate, and then the king says, do not neglect anything you have recommended. Do it all. Make sure you fill in every detail. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai, and he led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, I can just imagine, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, no problem there. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. And he told Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends, everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, well, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. And before you know it, a la Mark, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared, the second banquet. Wow. So what happens here is the author of Esther shows how a series of seemingly trivial circumstances fit together to overrule the evil intentions of Haman, the Agagite. Now understand, circumstance, and I hope you've seen it up to this point, but certainly as we get deeper in, and especially what takes place here in chapter 6, circumstance is a very powerful literary motif throughout all of Esther, from beginning to end. And so far, we've seen Haman use it as an opportunity to use those circumstances to his advantage, right? He's going into the king, going to ask him, okay, well, king, I got this idea. Remember, we kind of have this plan down the road, but there's this guy, that Mordecai, that just really bugging me. Could we just kind of take care of him? As a matter of fact, by the way, I've already set up the gallows. So, you know, it's no big deal. You know, you don't have to worry about it, King Xerxes. That's his thinking. He's taking all these coincidences, all these circumstances to get to this point. And we're going to see it. It's going to continue just a little bit longer, maybe one chapter, maybe about half a chapter. But the scheme, in the scheme of things, I think for us here today, and the Jewish people, the hope is that circumstance here is actually viewed as God at work on behalf of his people. And that's what's really happening. Listen to what the Bible Knowledge Commentary writes about chapter 6. I think this is really cool. The tensions which have been building throughout the account, the book of Esther, if you will, begins to dissipate. You know, things, remember about chapter 5, verse 2, where Xerxes extends the gold scepter to Esther, that was the pinnacle, and now things are starting to sort of just track downward a little bit in the story. In other words, what's happening is previously understood facts, things that we've read, and some of them didn't make sense, are beginning to take on new meaning, and almost incredible circumstances point to God's hand guiding the course of events. And he goes on and writes, the entire course of history for the Jewish nation, and this is really special, the entire course of the history for the Jewish nation was changed because a pagan king, hundreds of miles from the center of God's activities in Jerusalem, could not sleep. Who would have thought? He's talking about Xerxes in Susa, hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem, the center of God's activity, if you will. Who would have thought? And he says, Jewish people all over the Persian Empire, and especially in Palestine itself, were unaware of God's dealings till long after the fact. But he writes, but read in the light of God's covenants to Abraham, to Moses, and David, the readers could well appreciate the sovereignty or the sovereign action of God. Amen to that. Isn't that amazing? And let's look at the beginning of the chapter, Xerxes' sleepless nights, verses 1 through 3. That night the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. And so the king asks, well, what honor, what did we do for Mordecai? What did we do for him? So we can see, just in these 3 verses, we're seeing God is working through all kinds of circumstances here. First of all, that night the king could not sleep. And literally the Hebrew means that the sleep fled from him. In other words, the sleep was literally, you know, the desire or the want or even the ability to sleep had actually been sucked out of him. He wasn't even tired. And God, on the very night before Haman was coming to seek permission to hang Mordecai, what does God do? He gives Xerxes this giant dose of insomnia. And it's interesting because there was no Facebook at that time, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy to me. If you ever see people's posts, and some of them, they're up at 4 in the morning, they're up at 1 o'clock in the morning. And what do they do? They can't sleep. So what do? They go on Facebook. Xerxes didn't have Facebook. He couldn't go there. So instead, Xerxes calls for the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. And I want you to understand, this wasn't just some casual reading to make the king sleep. Okay, you know how, you know what that does. You're tired, you know, you're kind of trying to sleep, you're not quite tired, but so what do? You pick up a book and you start reading, and hopefully it's going to put you up. That's not what's going on here. That's not why Xerxes called for the reading of the book of the Chronicles. Because what happened, this was, according to the Hebrew wording here, was a continuous, extensive reading. So in other words, it was a long, you know, kind of an all-night kind of thing that included the record of Mordecai exposing the assassination plot against King Xerxes 5 years ago. And it more than likely did, I mean, you could kind of go two ways because the text doesn't necessarily tell us, but it more than likely lasted most of the night, maybe all night long, right up until Haman makes his entrance in the morning in verse 4. But before that, as they're going through and his attendants are reading, you know, his record of his you know, reign, Xerxes asks his attendants in verse 3, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? And they answer him, they say, well, king, nothing. We've never done anything for him. Nothing. There's nothing in the records. I don't remember it. I was here, remember? And Bill, you were here, and Joe, yeah. No, we haven't done anything for him. Not a thing. Not a thing. In this revelation, if you understand what's taking place here, this revelation sets Xerxes' mind into a turmoil. It's almost like he's pulling his hair out. And it's not because he so much cares that, you know, for Mordecai, like saying, oh, well, gee, we should have did. No, it's because he was more concerned about his own life. And rightfully so, because if you're familiar with ancient history, especially ancient Near Eastern history, many monarchs were removed from office through assassination. I mean, it was common. It was the common mechanism for replacing kings. And if you didn't know, as a matter of fact, our own King Xerxes, the very guy we're talking about right here, this one, he was assassinated not too long after this, in 465 BC, by the actual commander of his personal guard. So, you know, that's what's going on here. For Xerxes realizing it's just plain political foolishness not to reward a man who prevented his assassination from happening. One author described it as cheap life insurance. Because the mentality is, well, if someone else sees I didn't reward Mordecai for exposing the plot, what's going to happen when another one comes down the road and nobody says anything because we didn't give this guy anything? There's no reward. Why should I even bother? And Xerxes, he's stunned that Mordecai received absolutely nothing for his efforts. And he spends some of his sleepless night wondering, how can I rectify his neglecting of Mordecai? And I'm going to add here, I put here, needless to say, it was not by mistake that Mordecai was not rewarded 5 years ago. Remember when we went from chapter 2 to, let me make sure I get my head on here. Yeah, right, okay. Yeah, we went from chapter 2 to chapter 3. Mordecai reveals the plot. And right at the beginning of chapter 3, we have nothing about Mordecai, but we have Haman. It wasn't by mistake. And like you, like me, I'm sure you're thinking, well, what happened? Why didn't Xerxes give Mordecai his due reward for revealing the assassination plot? Well, here's our answer. It wasn't by mistake. It was not a fluke that Xerxes could not sleep the night before Haman's appearance before him, and that he just happened to have the book of Chronicles on his nightstand. Understand, none of that was coincidence. Yeah, amen. And it goes on a little further because it clears up the mystery as to why Esther delayed revealing Xerxes her petition and her request until the next day after her first banquet with the king and Haman. Remember last week we saw that. Xerxes says, well, what can I do for you, queen? And she says, well, come to a banquet. I'm going to have a banquet. Come to the banquet. So he comes to the banquet and he asks her again, Queen, I know that you weren't going to risk your life just so you can bring me to a banquet. You've got something in mind. Spill it. And she says, well, wait a minute. Let's have another banquet. And tomorrow I'll reveal. Why did she do that? I don't think she knew, but God knew what was going to be happening that night and what was going to be hoping to happen that morning, and God intervened. I mean, it was all God. I don't think there's any doubt that God is working through these circumstances that we humans think we can control, just like Haman did in verse 4, when the king says, who's in the court in the morning? And now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace, and why did he do that? To speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. So see, all this time, Haman in his mind, he thinks, I got everything under control. Everything's going just the way it was supposed to. Just the way I planned. All these circumstances are in my control and in my power, and everything is going just the way we planned it. I mean, what we're seeing here is Haman's hatred 3.0. It's his final updated program and his attempt to eliminate his nemesis, Mordecai. And even though the plan to destroy Mordecai and his people had already been set to take place, remember, in the 12th month, the month of Adar. Remember, it's a little ways down the road yet. But Haman's hatred, he just couldn't wait any longer. Every time he passed the king's gate and he looked, there's Mordecai. And I put quotes around poor here, poor Haman. He thinks he has everything under control, when in reality he arrives in the king's presence at the wrong time for the wrong evil reason, and it gets worse. Because we're going to see in verses 5 through 13, we're going to actually see Mordecai's majesty, and we're going to see Haman's humiliation in one big switch, just like that. Look at verse 5. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, still thinking, I got everything under control, everything's, coincidence, circumstance, this is perfect. And he's not even expecting this. He's saying, oh my, there's more. There's more coming. Who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, For the man the king delights to honor, have him bring the royal robe the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested. And here's where things turn upside down for Haman. He's probably assuming for yourself. Instead, he says for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. And he says, do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe, he got the horse, he robed Mordecai, led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief, and he told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, and this is upside down. It says, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you can't stand up against him. You will surely come to ruin. I'm thinking, what a knucklehead. I mean, Haman, he didn't see it coming. He's standing on the railroad tracks, and the freight train is coming down the line. The horn is blowing, the lights are flashing, and it hits him right between the eyes. What irony. Egotistical Haman was beside himself with pride and joy over Xerxes' question, and he was so excited and so enamored with his own self, he forgot about why he even came to Xerxes in the first place, which, remember, what was that for? So that he could get permission to hang Mordecai. He forgets all, he doesn't even say a word. I guess he's thinking, well, we'll get this in a few minutes. His self-centeredness is on full display as he ponders the king's request. And Haman, his mind's got to be going a mile a minute at this point. He's saying, well, let me think. Let me think for a minute. He says, even though I have plenty of money, remember, he's filthy rich. I have lots of sons. Remember, he had 10 sons. And even though I've been honored by both the king and I've been honored by the queen, it's still not enough. There's something missing. There's got to be more for me. What could that be? What could that be? It's got to be something. I think I've got it. It's something that money can't buy. It's the respect of the people. That's what I've got to have. That's what I want. Because his lust for popularity became his obsession. And he says, here's what you should do for me, to Xerxes. Now he doesn't say me, or that man, I mean. He says, have them bring a royal robe, and the king is worn, and the horse the king is ridden, and we've read it. I'm not going to read it, but you understand what's going on. And see what the Haman is doing here? It's so subtle. If you don't read kind of in between, you're going to miss it. So here it is. Here's what he's doing. He has everything that he possibly could have except one thing. He could not be king. Why? Xerxes was the king, right? He was number 2, but Xerxes was number 1. He wanted to be number 1. But he thought, I may not be able to be the king, but I can sure look like the king. I can dress like him. I'll wear his robe. I'll ride like the king. I'll ride on one of his horses. And I'll be publicly proclaimed as the man the king delights to honor. And Haman is saying in his head, who could ask for anything more? I've got it. And then he gets hit with verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew. I mean, this is super irony personified. One writer says about what takes place in verse 10, he says that this is the most ironically, and he uses the word comical, which is I guess if you, it depends on what side you're on here, whether it's comical or not. I guess if you're, yeah, you can look at it from a comical standpoint, not so much Haman, but yeah, he says this, he writes, this is the most ironically comical scene in the entire Bible. Verse 10, chapter 6 of Esther. Who would have thought? I kind of think it might be Christ's resurrection might take first place, but that's, you know, if that's the case, number two, this is definitely number two. But look what happens. The planned death of Mordecai turns into him being honored by the very man who planned his execution. While at the same time, it marks the beginning of the end for Haman himself. Haman, and if you look at it from, Haman had demanded Mordecai's respect. Remember, that was what this was all about. Every time, all he wanted Mordecai to do was to bow down and honor him. That's all. That's all he wanted. But instead, Haman has to give respect to Mordecai, and Mordecai never asked for it. Isn't that a... Are you seeing the dynamics that are taking place here? Mordecai, and if you add something else, and remember, Mordecai, just the day before was what? He was in sackcloth and ashes, remember? In mourning, wailing, and crying out because of what was going to be happening. And now, the next day, he's going to be dressed in the king's royalty. Isn't God cool? Can you imagine how proud Haman felt as... proud, the right word. As he dresses Mordecai and leads him through Susa, saying, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. I mean, all the pride. There wasn't any pride. That was he was humiliated. Totally and completely. So I guess if you look at it from a human standpoint, which is more satisfying here? Is it Mordecai's majesty? Or is it Haman's humiliation? I guess you could go either way. And listen, the New Living Translation describes Haman as dejected and completely humiliated in verse 12. And I'm trying to think, what could we use for an example to get a picture of what Haman must have looked like and how he was feeling inside at that very moment as he's leading Mordecai with the king's robe and the king's horse and saying, this is what happens to guys that the king honors. And I thought of one thing. I think of what is happening here reminds me of exactly what took place on the night of November 7th, 2016. When someone who was so convinced that they were so deserving didn't get it. I mean, do you remember those pictures of hopelessness and horror on the faces of those people as they're crying and they're wailing and their expectations were way, way up here? And they were immediately smashed and put in the garbage heap. I kind of think that's exactly how Haman was feeling here in this moment in his life. And it gets worse for him. Verse 12, after Mordecai returned to the king, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, his normal role, his job. But Haman, he rushed home with his head covered in grief. And he told Zeresh and his wife and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. And he's thinking, like they did before, they're going to encourage him. They're going to come up with another plan to handle this. They're going to take those circumstances, and look what they say. Verse 13, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. Wait a minute, that's not what they said over here. In verse 14 of chapter 5, when they said, have gallows built 75 feet high and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. What happened? Boy, they changed tunes real quick. And they said, and you will surely come to ruin. And I don't know, is it possible that even Haman's wife and his friends somehow, maybe they just found out that Mordecai was a Jew? It doesn't tell us. Maybe they didn't know, because actually the better translation for since Mordecai is really if Mordecai. They're saying if Mordecai is of Jewish origin, okay, or it could be since, coming to the place where, yeah, he is of Jewish origin. They sense that it's the God of Israel at work on behalf of his people. Even they get it. The New Living Translation translates it, you will never succeed in your plans against him. And it will be fatal to continue to oppose him. Wow, that's not what he was looking for. Remember when we were in the book of Joshua, and as the Israelites were conquering the various cities and areas and stuff, and some of the cities would just be fearful because they had heard about what had happened before. Same thing here. Apparently, Zeresh and Haman's friends must have knew of those stories of the God of Israel with Joshua. They knew, wait a minute, you're beating yourself, you're beating your head against the wall here, Haman. So Haman gets absolutely no comfort from the very people who gave him the idea in the first place, to take out Haman. I mean, this is just amazing. Haman learns, and unfortunately it's too late to do anything about it, but he learns a deep Bible truth here. Never, ever, ever underestimate the power of God and his love for his people. Yeah, and that's a good one. Write it down, because we all need that truth in our lives. Never, ever underestimate the power of God in his love for his people. The Apostle Paul understood that truth. He understood it clearly. I think that's why he could write Romans 8:28 and Philippians chapter 4, verse 10 through 13 with a straight face. Let me read them to you. I think you're probably familiar with them, but let me remind you. Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and I know sometimes these verses are just thrown out, lackadaisically. But listen to what it says. And we know that on all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Guys, that's a promise. That's a promise. And it fits perfectly with what we're seeing here in the book of Esther. Listen to Philippians chapter 4, verse 10. This is Paul writing. He says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. He's writing to the church at Philippi. Indeed, he says, you have been concerned, but you have not no opportunity to show it. And listen to what he says. This is where it fits in with what we're talking about in Esther. He says, I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. And he goes on in verse 12. He says, I know what it's like to be in need. I've been there. I've had nothing. And I was okay. And then he says, and I know what it's just like to have plenty. I said, I've been really having some good times too. It's been all right. I've had everything I've needed. But he says, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. And that's whether well-fed or hungry. Whether living in plenty or in want. Doesn't make sense, but yeah, when you see what, if you take the Bible truth that we never underestimate the power of God's power and His love for His people, Paul says in verse 13, I can do everything through Him who gives me strength. That's how it connects. It makes what Paul says in Romans 8:28 and Philippians chapter 4 verses 10 through 14 or whatever it was, 13. It makes it work. It makes sense. We don't have to just give those verses out lackadaisically because they have meaning. They're true. They're true. And John Martin writes this. He says, even though God's people often disobeyed Him, we're not talking about us, so don't, this is... Even though God's people often disobeyed Him, even though they were often not spiritually or even physically where God wanted them to be, deliverance would come. Why is that? Because God is faithful, not us. And when I hear that, I like that. It feels so good to know that. But we'll see next week. It's a little too late for Haman, unfortunately. Look at verse 14. While they were still talking with him, that means his wife and his friends, they're talking back and forth of what took place and all that sort of thing. While they're still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. Not that they were forcibly, that was normal procedure. The king would always send servants to pick up the guests and bring them to the banquet. So it's not like something bad was happening, it's just that it was time to go. He couldn't say any more. So with his world crashing down around him, Haman is whisked off to the very banquet that at one point he could not wait to attend. He would have slept on Esther's doorstep if he could have. Waiting for that banquet hall door to open so he could be there. So at one point that's his thinking, but now he's dreading it with everything he is. Because he doesn't know what's going to happen. For him, this has been an almost unbelievable emotional roller coaster. I mean, huge hills, those ones like you have in Cedar Point. If you've ever been there in Ohio. Huge. I mean, they have to give you oxygen to... No, I'm kidding. You don't. But they're high. They are high. And yet those terrifying valleys, that's where he is right now. He's at the bottom of the hill. No, I like roller coasters. Not this one. No, leave me on the platform. I'm not riding. Isn't this amazing? And you thought it couldn't get any better, but this is Mordecai's majesty. Who would have thought? What Mordecai had done was 5 years earlier, it was a distant memory, and then all of a sudden, and he was just in sackcloth and ashes, fearful of his life, and now he's being honored. Folks, it's just not coincidence taking place here. And the thing that, what a story. The amazing thing, this is true. This isn't a fairy tale. This is a true story. This is genuine drama at its very best. And I've seen 2 movies on Esther, and unfortunately, you know how you can't do everything in a movie, but man, they miss it all. I mean, they're good, they're entertaining, they kind of give the gist of the story, but boy, they miss some of the stuff we're seeing here today. And there's more to come. We get Esther's second banquet, and we get Haman's hanging. All in one day, next Sunday. So be here. And as they used to say on Hawaii 5-0, aloha. Let's pray. Father, thank you again. I don't think there's a human author that has ever lived that could write a story like this. The twists and the turns, the irony, the irony is almost at every verse. We go from one extreme to the other extreme. So many surprises, so many. God, thank you for giving it to us, because it demonstrates in a very real, very believable way how amazing you are. And Father, I pray for me, I pray for each one that's here this morning, I pray for your people everywhere. Father God, I pray that we would never, ever, ever underestimate your power and the love that you have for us. God, thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Praise the Lord. Wednesday nights.